Now, I think maybe we can turn to how to help Israel, because we have one viewer who has said, you know, can you be more specific on how to pray for Israel? Because, and you know, in my prayer life, sometimes I pray because I'm supposed to pray, but there are times for me, like when I get into the car and I look at this incredible panorama in the community in which I live, and that's a time that I feel very close to God, and I find myself praying at that time. So how do we pray for Israel?
Well, one of the ways, now this may be something unfamiliar to some, and I'm just going to introduce it, and you'll have to make a decision from there. But there is a special prayer in that prayer service. It's called in Hebrew the Amidah. It simply means standing. It also, they call it the Shmoneh Esrei, which is simply the 18 benedictions.
But it's one prayer, right?
It's a series of prayers. There's actually
okay.
18 of them.
Okay.
Actually, there's 19, but I don't want to confuse anybody at this point.
Okay.
They were basically put together and written by Ezra and the men of the Great Assembly going back to the time after the Babylonian captivity. But what Ezra did was, it was a prayer designed to bring the community together. And they're short little prayers, because he knew that they would be dispersed in various places, and the way the men of the Great Assembly came together, they just structured this as sort of, each prayer is 2 or 3 sentences.
Okay.
Now, you can start out with the blessings for, you know, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then it moves on from there to the holiness and the sanctification of God's name. But you will come to prayers in there about the rebuilding of the temple, and about restoring the judges to Israel, all different aspects of the nation of Israel. So what I do is I will read the prayer, I read it in Hebrew, and then I read it in English, and then I just take time to express from my heart what that might mean to me. Now, if you were to go to a service, you would see Jews going through this particular prayer like 90 miles an hour in Hebrew, and you're wondering, did they get anything out of this?
Yeah.
But I would encourage those, if you were to pick up a Siddur or a Hebrew prayer book, to look for that particular prayer. Now, that might not be feasible for some. The other way to deal with this is that most of the Psalms deal with the nation of Israel. And most of the Psalms are in some way part of the prayer service. Now, in particular, every day, Psalms 145 to 150.
Okay, so let's stop here so people can jot down Psalm 145 to 150. So,
yes.
So that little block of Psalms.
Those Psalms are very important.
Okay.
And every Jew that prays in their liturgy time will pray those Psalms. So my feeling is, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. And we are, in a sense, joining with them to pray with those particular Psalms, because they are, particularly Psalm 145 is recited every day, twice a day. Very important Psalm, and you'll see it as you go through it. One of the things about Psalm 145, for instance, it's an acrostic. So it's, you know, A is for something, B is for something. You go through the entire alphabet. And the same is with this particular psalm. So it's a very powerful one. Also, Psalm 30. Now, that's a psalm for the inauguration of the temple that came out of the heart of David. So that's another good one that's said every single day. And then if you go to Shabbat, or the Sabbath, there are all kinds of psalms. I'll tell you Psalm 90, 91, 92, all the way up to 98 and 99, Psalm 27, Psalm 45, all these different psalms. So I think probably the best way for those of us who are kind of unfamiliar with the prayer service is to take these psalms and enter in that way. Pray these psalms for the nation of Israel.
So perhaps to take one psalm a day.
That would be great. And really get to know it and let it be part of you.
Okay.
And then as you are reciting it, then you let the Spirit give expression to what that might mean. You might see a verse in there and it just stands out, and you pray that verse in terms of the land of Israel. So I hope that, I don't want to give too much here, but I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, because we are talking about how to help Israel.
Right.
Ascending to Zion.
Right.
And we're not in Israel.
Right.
And yet we want to be able to help.
Exactly.
And this spiritual direction is one way that we can help.
To me, the most important.
Okay.
This is where you got to start.
Okay.
Now we'll go off in some other directions here, but you simply must start with the spiritual aspect.
Well, let's move on to another way we can help Israel, because you and I were talking about the media and how the American media, and even more in Europe, the European
Yes, that's
media, is really grabbing onto this Arab propaganda and is not giving a clear picture. And yet, how is Israel responding, and how can we help?
Yes, this is a very, it's a complex problem. It's a difficult problem to overcome. Israel has always kind of sat back. The difference we were talking about this the other day, the difference I see between what the media does and what Israel tries to do, okay? The media becomes a propaganda arm, and everything that gets spit out, not all media, but you know what I'm saying, the vast majority.
Well, they have to sell advertising.
Exactly. And they have taken a position, and so then they spew out the propaganda of the position that they've taken. Right. Israel, on the other hand, tries just to explain the truth of a particular event or narrative or story or whatever. Okay. And they are not really very good at the propaganda war, which in my mind is probably a good thing, you know, because once you move into that realm, then you move into the realm of lies, and then you can't distinguish between the truth and lies. So let me tell you, at one point during our trip, I had met a young gentleman named Yoni Forsyth. He was a soldier with the IDF.
Now, explain IDF.
Oh, the Israeli Defense Force.
Okay, it's their army.
It's their army, and of course, everyone has to serve in the military. Yoni emigrated from Great Britain, and he decided to give it all up and move to Israel and serve in the military. And he was actually in the media desk, at the media desk in the IDF. He was assigned to us, a media crew, when we went up to the Barak Brigade up in the Golan Heights one day. And I ended up sitting with him in the very back of the van, so we just chatted for about 6 hours about all kinds of stuff. Very interesting young man, and I, got to learn a lot about him. What was so interesting, too, is that he was going to, the day we went was 2 days before the release of Gilad Shalit. He and his captain were going down to the Gaza, and they were part of the release of Gilad Shalit at the Gaza, at the crossover there. He was in charge of being a liaison between the release and the media. And I'm sitting here going, oh my gosh, what are the odds on this one? So I asked him after the release if we'd be able to interview him. And of course he had to go up the food chain and see if that was possible. And they did agree. Unfortunately, they were not allowed to share a lot because there was a media blackout on Gilad and his family. But we did manage to go over there in the giant building in Jerusalem. It's the media building. So every media outlet on the planet is in this building. Fox and CNN are up on the top, and they're, the European and they're just all over there. So they take us into this little room where we're going to have our interview. Now, Yoni and his boss is Captain Eitan Buchman. And he is the head of this particular media desk. So we were interviewing with them, and they are the liaison with the American media. So I began to try to ask questions. Okay, listen, all these other media have an attitude, an agenda, and they spew out propaganda. How are you guys going to combat that? And I said, I don't think you've done a very good job in the past of presenting your side of the story.
Well, good for you that you spoke up and said that.
I did. I got to do that in an interview. And, I was very gracious
in my
questions.
Gracious. Okay.
But, he said, and it struck me, he said, really the only way they can do it is with the truth. It was
the way Israel can do it.
The only way they cannot combat it with more propaganda. They can only combat it with the truth. So when an event comes and it's distorted in the media, like the flotilla incident.
Wait, explain the flotilla incident.
Well, there was a ship that was sent from Turkey. They wanted to land the ship in the Gaza. They did not have permission to get into those waters, and it became an international incident. Israel tried to stop the ship.
So what was the ship bringing to Gaza?
Well, it was supposed to be bringing, humanitarian items, but there was a lot of weaponry on board.
Okay, all right.
So the Israel, the Navy was trying, was to stop it, and several of the soldiers went on board, and some of them were beaten, and I believe one died. think I'm correct on that. And so it turned into an international incident, but everybody took the side of the Palestinians and those that tried to break the blockade and land in Gaza to bring in humanitarian. And this is not, not at all what this incident was about.
Yeah.
So they felt that it was most important for them to try to explain the truth of what happened.
And
really,
what's the truth of what happened?
what I just told you. It was not a humanitarian ship.
Okay.
It was its purpose was to stir up international trouble. It was not a peaceful venture. The Israeli soldiers were not armed, and yet when they got on board, they were beaten with beams and things that that were weaponry, etc. It was very ugly, and blood was shed, and it was not provoked by Israel.
Okay.
It was provoked by the Palestinians.
Okay. I think we might consider the word propaganda because that
Okay.
has a certain connotation.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that what's happening in my experiences with the American media is sensationalism, because sensationalism makes an interesting show,
Right.
so that people will come in to watch
Right.
it.
And that's true.
And propaganda is sort of intentionalized, and I'm not sure that it's all intentional.
Well, that particular incident, actually, it was one of 22. We think there was
One
just
of 22 what?
flotillas that
Oh,
went
okay.
to try to break the blockade.
Okay.
That one became an international incident because of blood was shed. And it was, the other ones, they kept trying to probe and break through. And in fact, I believe they were planning another one after that as well with all women, if you can imagine. No
Yeah,
comment.
yeah.
But the story just needed to be told truthfully without all the propaganda that,
Okay.
that somehow Israel caused this whole thing.
Okay.
So this is a problem area.
Okay. Now, we did get a question from one of our
Okay.
viewers about prayer, and I would just encourage those who are viewing this program to feel free to type in your questions if you have them. Now, we're talking about the media, and you've talked about how the government of Israel is trying to combat this sensational news, which is incorrect.
Correct. Yeah.
What do we do?
We have a responsibility to educate ourselves.
Okay.
And when we hear things that are not true, then we need to have a platform somewhere. I mean, it could be at, the table, when you're having a meal with your family and Uncle Fred comes over and starts spewing off some propaganda. You have a responsibility to say, no, that's not the truth. This is the truth. So the only way you're going to know the truth, certainly you need to pray, and you need to use wisdom, and you need to go to sources that are reputable. You can't just pick stuff off the internet and say this is true. You really need to know your sources.
Can you suggest where we can go?
Well, it is tough. For news in Israel, I tend to use Arutz Sheva.
Okay, now spell that for us.
A-R-U-T-Z.
A-R-U-T-Z, Arutz.
Arutz Sheva, S-H-E-V-A. At
Yes.
arutzsheva.org, you can go there.
Okay.
Now, they tend to be pretty, what's the word I want to use? Neutral in how they do have a position. They are more conservative. We recognize that immediately. But they do try to report neutrally as best they can.
Okay.
I don't think there's such a thing as a complete, everyone has a worldview and agenda.
Right.
You got to
Right.
weigh that
True.
out. But as far as getting, I think, pretty solid information, you can start there.
Okay.
And then you can get a sense of the story, and then you can begin to look in other places. The American media, most of it doesn't really have a very good understanding of what's going on in Israel, and also doesn't really report that much.
Okay.
Although there are some sites that you could probably pick up some. There's a site called Honest Reporting.
HonestReporting.com?
I think it's .com. It could be .org, but I'm
Just
sure
put
if
in
you
Honest
Google,
Reporting in Google.
you'll be able to, and you'll be able to pick up some pretty good information. But I think people are also finding now these sites where you're supposed to check news stories like Scopes and Truth in, I can't remember the name of the other one. But even that, you'll find that even there, sometimes the stories are not accurate. Now, I also recommend reading the Israel media, Jerusalem Post, and or Haaretz. just knowing that they do tend towards a certain
Okay.
slant, but it's good, it's good to follow up there. It's not easy.
Now, I have a suggestion.
Sure.
That you might go to the Bible Interact Facebook page and give some suggestions about how we can inform ourselves
Right.
about what is happening.
And of course, there's lots of books have been written. There's one by Alan Dershowitz, The Case for Israel. Now, Alan Dershowitz, like a left-wing lawyer guy, but he wrote a very good book about
Okay.
Israel. So
The Case for Israel.
yeah, Alan Dershowitz.
Dershowitz
Yeah.
is the last name. So you just go to Amazon and
Yeah,
you type in.
Dershowitz,
Okay.
Dershowitz.
But if you just put in The Case for Israel
Yeah.
and it'll crop up.
Exactly.
It'll crop up.
Mitchell Bard, another one, Myths and Facts, A Guide to the Arab-Israeli Conflict is
Okay.
quite good.
All right. What's his
as
last
well.
name again?
Bard.
Bard.
B-A-R-D,
B-A-R-D.
yeah.
Myths and Facts.
Yeah. Now, there is
Okay.
another book, and I sort of hesitate to recommend it because, and I probably shouldn't, just, it does seem to err a little bit on the side of propaganda. I don't want to go either side propaganda. You know what I'm saying? I'm
Right.
looking to try to just understand historically, what the truth
Okay.
is. Now, there are good articles on the web. I'm just, asking to exercise caution.
Well, let's get a dialogue going on Facebook, and then other
Okay.
people maybe can make some recommendations of how we can
Absolutely.
become more knowledgeable. We have had a question, which I think is a good one. Once we understand what is happening, how do we disseminate it? How do we get the truth out?
Well, of course, one way, which is probably not too popular, I think it's always good to write to the letters to the editor.
Okay.
I mean, that's a tough thing. And when you live in a community like I do, you're going to be attacked. I mean, people are going to be ranting and raving with your letter, but you don't know who you're going to reach. When you write a letter, when you're informed and you put a coherent article together of, a couple of paragraphs and send it to to the editor, you don't know who might be really touched by it and say, well, yeah, now this makes sense to me. I understand, even though you're going to have to deal with, the attacks.
Yeah.
So that is certainly one way to get the message out. Mostly, it's going to be in your day-to-day.
Right.
Just who you meet and who you run into,
Okay.
and an opportunity. You may only have 2 sentences to be able to share with somebody who just might casually say something that is not true. You'll just respond, and you might even get into a dialogue. I mean, I ended up in a conversation about some of this stuff with a grocery clerk in Whole Foods who asked me questions because I was buying matzah, and she started asking me questions about Israel. It's like, you just don't know where it's going to come from.
Yeah.
Be informed for your family. That's probably one of the most important places for you to be able to share now. And if you have a larger platform, if you teach in a church or in a congregation of some kind, and you'll ruffle feathers in church too.
Yeah. I actually have a personal experience I can
Go ahead.
share, which gives something specific. I was in Israel studying my Hebrew at an ulpan, and there were 2 Palestinian girls who had been sent. This was back in 1999, before it just exploded.
Right.
And but I got to know them fairly well. They invited me to Nablus, which is Shem
Yep.
in Hebrew,
Mhm.
and one of them started talking about her family owned the land right along on the coast, and they had been driven out by Israel, but that it was going to be theirs again. They were going to take it back again. And I can't remember exactly. There was a number of things that were conveyed, and her other friend would kick her under, stop, be quiet, don't say that. And another thing that they tried to tell me was that their family had been there forever and ever and ever, and the Jews were these latecomers that came in and kicked them out. Well, that's not true. If you read Mark Twain, who was
Right.
there in the 1880s
yeah.
sometime, and he describes Israel as this wasteland with
Mosquito infested
very
swamp.
few people, a tiny, tiny little village,
Yeah.
and there were no trees because they had to cut. They paid taxes to the Ottoman Empire based
Right,
on how many
right.
trees were on the land, and there were just very few people. So it's when the British Mandate came in that it became prosperous enough that Arabs began coming in because they
Correct.
could get jobs.
Correct.
And yet they will say, oh, my family has been there for thousands of years. And
Well,
that's not true.
there are about 400,000 Jews in the land by the time we get to the Balfour Declaration and the time of the British.